Well, thank you, Andres. Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm gonna put this right here. I hope you have a bit more strength to finish the day. It's gonna be pink a little bit. It's gonna be, like Andres said, about representation, of course, and I'm happy to be in that section. But it's gonna be some kind of reflection on what is ré, which is quite an important word in French, but a bit difficult to use also and to translate. So it's an ongoing research, I would say, that crosses the research that we do at the office and the question that is raised by David's point on Rez de Ville. Ré is about this idea that it's something that is flat in a way. It comes from the Latin radere, and it's something that is flattened, that is polished. And I think, and I will try to talk about that, that Rez de Ville is, of course, something much more thick, much deeper than the only rez-de-chaussée idea that we can have, because it's not just one level of reference. It's something much more complex, as it has been said by different people today before. And I'm going to talk maybe about the idea that this ré could be called Rez de Ville, but could be called also rez de terre, earth ray, with the idea that infrastructure, if I focus on this kind of elements, the infrastructures that have been built for so many years now could be seen as a topography, as a new topography, could be seen as something that creates a new geography on our Earth. I think as a starting point, I would like to make a relation with and a reference to Eugène Viollet-le-Duc. He made studies on the Mont Blanc. I don't know, how do you say Mont Blanc in English? I guess White Mont, Mont Blanc. But you know what I'm talking about. And he looked at geography and the Earth as an architect, using the tools as an architect. We're trying a bit the same things, quite the opposite in a way, using the tools maybe and the words that could be used as geologists or geographers that we are not, looking at architectural phenomenons and urban phenomenons. He described the Mont Blanc, saying that in 1875 that it was such a wreck in a way because it had been demolished and flattened. We had taken the trees out to make woods, to use the wood. We had made fields to make cultivated spaces. And he tried to understand how to change the Mont Blanc and to restore in a way the Mont Blanc, and trying to propose some new small infrastructures, understanding the torrents, beds, and proposing very small dams that could be a way to give more thickness or depth to the landscape, to the natural functioning of the whole mountain. So it's in a way the work that we've been doing for many years. This is just a kind of installation that we did on the invitation of Hashim for Venice in 2021. It's a big piece that we called The Earth is an Architecture, and we wrote a book about this, trying to look at the Earth as an architecture, meaning that all these phenomena are totally entangled now, and it's difficult to conceive the architecture as something that is set or put on the Earth. Rather, the architecture is the shaping of the world itself. But there are many scientists like Zalasiewicz that, for instance, are explaining, he's a geologist, and he's explaining that the stratas of the cities are in a way like mountains or volcanoes. It's a big amount of sediments that are brought on a special point in a very limited amount of time. So it's also a comparison to the way the Earth is created. Now I'm going to go to the case of Paris and trying to look at the infrastructures and the morphology and the geomorphology that it creates. This is an image that we made of the situation of Paris, when you can see the large, let's say, the macro geology or macro morphology, but also you can see already appear all the lines of the infrastructure, because the infrastructure are mainly lines, and those lines are elevated. Those lines are not flat. Those lines are not just even. This is maybe the idea of the ordinary or the normal or the traditional Rez de Ville in pink that you could find, that is the continuous Rez de Ville. The idea that it's isotropic, meaning that it can go in every direction. And it confronts itself to the geography in black. In this case, this is Paris hill, Belleville, where you can have this limited Rez de Ville, where the Rez de Ville cannot go too much further because of the geography. And we make the opposite of this, and still in pink, we can have the Rez de Ville, but the infrastructural Rez de Ville this time. The infrastructural Rez de Ville that is much more like following the lines of the infrastructure, like the beds of the infrastructure, confronting to the black and white of the more traditional urban fabric. So the black and the pink creates maybe in a way two worlds, but they have to work together, of course. They work together, but at the same time, the infrastructure creates a lot of limits and discontinuities. The ordinary Rez de Ville on the right, which puts the infrastructure, the old infrastructure, under the surface, and it doesn't alterate the surface, doesn't alterate the continuous level of the city. Whether the infrastructural Rez de Ville is something that alterates all the time this continuous level. So this new discontinuity needs to be understood and explained and represented, because it's quite complicated for us to understand this kind of very large phenomenons. And as I said, using this kind of method as Viollet-le-Duc did, we're also trying, of course, those are metaphors, but we're trying to use words that are come maybe from a more geographical and at the same time maybe architectural realm. So those infrastructure, they function as the riverbeds, as the continuous beds, because our era has been, of course, obsessed with the total continuity, and the infrastructure seeks for the continuity that will never be stopped. We've talked about cars before, but every kind of moving element seeks for the total continuity. I mean, the more perfect infrastructure that we can find is the sea, of course, and we managed to make the sea totally continuous by digging different, I don't find the word, different canals. So the riverbed and the escarpment, the scarp and the counterscarp that you can find in the military architecture is something that is quite interesting, because with this continuity, you create a discontinuity, you create a wall, you create, like in the river, you create something that is elevated and that creates the discontinuity. So this is one kind of word that we're using, and the idea this is a first map showing the river beds, but not just the bed of the river Seine, but the bed of the different infrastructure, and I will show them in more detail later. And a second word, and we could choose another one, but we found that this one is quite interesting. It could be the counterfort. The counterfort is also a military word, but it's the idea that with the infrastructure comes some kind of replica of the infrastructure, some kind of counterforts, like you can see in this representation of a fortification, where you can have all the replicas and the expanded effects of the infrastructure. So an infrastructure is not something that crosses and leaves the rest of the world still. No, it crosses, but it makes a lot of effects on the territories. And this is the maps with the riverbeds and the replicas or the counterforts, meaning all the very important architectural developments that come with the different infrastructure. So if and I didn't think about the cross in the screen, I'm sorry, but there's written Rez de l'eau, so the Rez of the water. And it's the idea that, of course, the main infrastructure, if I look at Paris still, is the River Seine. And maybe Paris is the city in Europe where the embankment of the river has reached the most the strongest point, I guess. This is a very old map of Paris in 1552, and you can see that the banks were still quite flat and natural, let's say, but then in very different point, like in Place Dauphine, for instance, in the Pont Neuf, with the elevation of the level of the bridge, everything has become like an architecture, and everything has the infrastructure has become really an embankment of the river. It's easier to see it in axonometry, where you understand that the buildings are in a way just the counterfort of this infrastructure, and all of these create some kind of again of new topography, like a new crust of the territory. Images that maybe we all know, where you see the different kinds of work, like before Haussmann, it was already very much like this, fortified and banked. But then later, in the post-war era, and the car infrastructures came also along the river. Another kind of infrastructure is of course the railroads, the Rez de Fer, which creates trenches and platforms. And the history could be looked at very closely in very different points, but you can see all these lines of railroads coming in the 19th century in black, those very thin lines that look like they are, just threads. In fact, they are not just thin lines. They are just a total transformation of the Rez, a total transformation of the soil, of the ground. And those designs are very interesting, like the calculations of the cubatures that you need to, the movements of soils that you need to do when you try to make a flat line to have the trains go all along this line. And the train also have this capacity not to have a very steep slope. So it's the continuity with the very, very slow slope. It's almost horizontal. So the red and the yellow is the above and the under, and the earth that you move from one point to the other. If I look a bit closely to a part of Paris on the west north part, you can see the last wall of Paris, and you can see this inside railroad, the Petite Ceinture. And this history is quite fascinating because, of course, at the beginning, it was put on the ground level. When we first make the railroads, we put them on the ground level because that's easier, but also because this part of the city was just non-urbanized land, so we could put it on the ground. But then we had to do elevated roads to go above, but also to dig again those lines of infrastructure to put them under the, well, 5 minutes, so I need to rush, to put them under the level of the ground. So those infrastructure, we do them, and then we do them again and again and again. So it's also the idea that the infrastructure is a time device. It's something that helps us inhabit the earth. So this was the map of the Rez de Fer and the Rez de Route, because I have many things to show you still. So Rez de Route is about the roads, the highways, and the main device that is inside Paris, which is the périphérique, the ring road that collects all the highways. And so we'll go quickly on this history. You see again the fortification, the last fortification, and the wall that is once again a topographical system. And this 35 kilometers wall, which is such an impressive piece of work, tremendous work that creates this geography. But then when we erase it, we try to flatten again the soil. And then at the end of this flattened soil, we put the périphérique. And the périphérique is another kind of topography, more like hills, but also because the car can take slopes that are steeper, and it makes also continuities with the existing fabric, with the existing streets. So it tries to connect a bit everywhere. This is the kind of drawing that tries to put together the different eras, the different time of history, where you have the railroad, then the wall, then the périphérique. Of course, it's a bit conceptual. Well, I will skip this. This is a reference to a kind of infrastructure that lasts while transforming themselves. Let me show you three kinds of explorations of the counterforts, as I called them, meaning different kinds of Rez de Ville, of Rez de Terre that could be imagined and that are actually coming from projects that we do at the office. We have several projects on these conditions. Some of them are going on. Maybe three, I chose three just to explain maybe three kind of ideas. Maybe the first one could be called over-edification. It's like the first stage of the counterfort. When you create the counterfort, you have the infrastructures. You see, this is the kind of part of Paris in the north where you have all these infrastructure, and namely a triangle between in the center of the railroads. And we did a project here, which is right here, trying to create this Rez de Ville that would at the same time make something out of the idea that you have infrastructure around you, everywhere around. And you can create housings and different kinds of uses. But this is the existing condition when you start to make the counterfort, where you have those elevated grounds on the two sides. And then there are first replicas, and then the project installs itself in the center between the rail lines, and it's trying. I'm just going to show you some photos. It's trying to create some kind of thick Rez de Ville on 2 levels, and even more than that, with very specific programs, because one of the interests is that you can create, because you have thick parcels, so you can create thick programs, but also elevated programs. It's also, for instance, there about sports, but also about the idea that because this project is built in load-bearing stone, except for the 2 first levels that are in concrete because of the span that you can make in concrete. It's the idea that this Rez de Ville can become also very specific in a way, very adapted to the conditions that we can find there. The second counterfort is a project quite fascinating that we're working on La Défense. So this is La Défense before the incredible infrastructure that arrived. It was a Rez de Ville, a traditional Rez de Ville continuous, and then came the first infrastructure, which is the train, the public transportation, and you can see the kind of tunnel, and then everything was lifted up, and it creates this kind of mountain, if I go on with my metaphor, and then the different counterforts arrived outside the infrastructure, but also inside. So it's a very total complex system, and it's also all the time changing on itself. So this is the Rez d'infrastructure, and we're working on a project where we're trying to find solutions. If I make the history very quickly, you have the first infrastructure coming there with the public transportation, then the different counterforts, and on both sides, the towers, of course, and then we're trying to find solutions to create new relationships, but those relationships, because we're talking about 15 meters high, you know, so it's not something that you can understand like a traditional city. We're trying to find a way to connect to the normal Rez de Ville. We're drawing this kind of topographical system also to understand, and this kind of axonometric views to understand where to put the connections, but also where to put also the full ground, the full soil, because those infrastructure, they have the capacity to create full soil situations, which is very, very important. And the last one, because I'm late, is another kind of situation. So the second one could be called erosion, like you take out some material. And then the third one is still another case where you can find a new way of using existing infrastructure. So this one is here in the east of Paris, and it's the existing refrigerated huge station where you kept the goods. And once again, you had the elevated boulevard and railroads that created this 2 levels, and underneath you had the station where you kept the goods. So this station had 2 levels of railways coming in and above. And the idea is that because, of course, you could destroy this, many people would like to destroy this kind of infrastructure. You could also claim that it's not full soil until the center of the world, but it's so big, and like it was said before, size matter in these questions. It's so big that, and it's so load bearing that if you put a lot of ground of soil on top, you can create this kind of new environmental situation. Because, and I will finish with this, I guess this rez d'infrastructure, rez de terre, creates a whole comprehensive mesh or matrix in the city that could be thought of as a very strong environmental tool to address all the very strong issues that we're facing now. Thank you very much.
A little over time, but we can take one question. If anybody has a burning question. Yes. Conrad.
How do you prevent confusion? I think of La Défense, or I think of the Deep Coast, some of the projects around the library. They can be awfully confusing. People get lost. They don't know what the data feed is. How does your work prevent that? Or do you agree that that is a problem?
Oh yeah, I agree that it is a problem. I think the idea is not to prevent from confusion, but to try to not to have this confusion anymore in those situations. For instance, the work that we're doing in La Défense, because like you just said, when you're on the top of the slab of La Défense, you have the sky, you have the towers, but you're floating, you don't know exactly where. You don't have any relation, you don't see the river anymore, and you don't know exactly where you are. So what we're trying to do, and I was thinking I will come back to what Guilherme Wisnik was saying yesterday, the infrastructure, they create not the infinite span, it's very different from that. It would be the infinite anchorage. But this anchorage is very, at this time, for the moment, I would say, is very brutal, is very primary. And we need to make a lot of work to make those infrastructure create a strong relationship between the earth, the people that uses and that walks on this crust of the earth, and also once again for all the environmental questions that are raised. I mean, I'm sure that the way that it's difficult to orientate yourself in these neighborhoods sometimes can find a solution also in the way you retrieve the sense of belonging to the earth, you know, if I can put it this way.
Great.
Thank you. Thank you.